Thank you very much for joining us here in Athens, but also in Amsterdam. And I gather there are also people from other parts of the world currently following us. It's absolutely fantastic to have so many people here today. 15 online, 20 here in the room. It's a really great pleasure to be organizing this yet again at a special occasion here in Athens. I want to thank Dimitris for the flexibility and setting everything up today. It's really great. I'm also very happy to introduce our speaker for today. You didn't put your name on the slide.
Well, it's like
Diamantis Petropoulos-Petalas from Derry College here in Athens. And it's just 2 years ago that he was a postdoc in the Hot Politics Lab. And I remember when we hired you, or where we interviewed you, because I had a little bit of money left for a 1 or 2 year postdoc in my ERC project. And we thought, let's get someone who does something completely differently than what we do. And we absolutely succeeded in doing this. And I'm personally very grateful that you joined our lab, because I think you were the first one in our lab to really open the doors towards neuroscience for us, because Diamantis is trained as a neuroscientist. And so that opened up a whole bunch of new avenues for research for us. And Diamantis will talk about one of these avenues that he opened up during this period. It's a research line he continued to develop in our lab and collected some data on. And even though this is a co-authored paper with me, right, I'm really curious what you're going to say, because it's been a while that we've worked on this. But we'll have the usual format. Diamantis will talk for 20-25 minutes, and then we get questions both online and offline. And we finish sharp at 5 local time in Athens and 4 local time in Amsterdam. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Hi, it's like such a very nice, warm introduction. Hello, everybody. I'm really happy and honored to be here. It actually feels like home, I have to say, because this is the very university that I graduated from. So I'm also a Pantheon graduate myself from the sociology department. But I developed like an interest in how the brain works, and how we bridge the gap, like from the social to, from the micro, like neuroscience stuff, and psychology, to the macro, like what sociology is interested at. So I started taking a couple of masters, like in closer and closer, like to neuroscience. And my PhD was like on media psychology and neuroscience, media neuroscience, if you wish. And from there on, so like the PhD was like in the Netherlands, obviously. And from there on, I worked as a postdoc. Before that, before like working at the Hot Politics Lab at the FU University. And then I moved like at the UvA for this postdoc. And I think that this is where I also found my second home, so the Hot Politics Lab. So I'm particularly happy and honored to sort of, feel like home today in that sense. All right, so I'm going to be talking about motivated cognition and belief updating, and whether there is like something interesting going on here. So contemporary approaches in cognitive regarding the cognitive mechanisms that are associated with ideological cognition. So how people think in terms of when political ideas come in. Suggest that the updating of beliefs as a sort of cognitive capacity may be a key function where cognitive biases manifest. So do we update beliefs based purely on how we weight evidence from everyday life and experience, like in a very rational and mathematical manner? Or does our motivation actually influence the way we process that information and we draw inferences from? So the practice of democratic thinking, I hope you agree with me, depends on our ability to update existing political ideas, right? Like based on evidence that come from socio-political reality in which we live in. And this ability actually requires a set of well-orchestrated cognitive operations, as I like to say, that allow one to weight information and juxtapose that like to its prior beliefs, right? And in light of that new evidence from experience, update these prior beliefs, following a Bayesian-like kind of manner. And I'd say, by contrast, strong ideologies are very rigid and sort of dogmatic ideas about reality, about morality, about identity, social identity, do not really serve this goal, this democratic goal. And possibly it actually impedes belief updating. So this is the departure point for this project. So whether and to what extent like these like hardcore ideological rigid beliefs that we hold about ourselves, about relationships with others, about our own existence, can actually influence the way we see and we judge evidence from experience. Okay, so whether it's about voters who explain away their preferred candidates' weaknesses, or economists who assert that fossil fuel is less harmful for the environment than lithium batteries are, or whether it's politicians that maintain that climate change is a hoax, we are reminded constantly that people's preferences can actually affect their beliefs. And this very idea is captured in Ziva Kunda's saying that people believe what they want to believe. So motivated reasoning is actually a fundamental human tendency for somebody to get his or her way into a conclusion that prioritizes their own goals and values ahead of others. So motivated reasoning occurs when people actively look for reasons why they're right, so confirming sort of their existing beliefs. They reject facts or research or evidence from experience that actually don't fit that prior belief. And we know from prior publications, like in political psychology, that ideology can cause analytical thinkers to reason their way into acceptance of dubious, uncertainty-driven decisions. And that's because it actually serves as a cognitive system which serves epistemic, existential, and relational needs, right? These kind of motives. Ever since there's quite some work actually documenting how cognitive and neural mechanisms of motivated reasoning play out. And of course, you know, I should of course start with a very famous study by Balceris and Dunning. It's an old study who actually showed it was one of the first studies to demonstrate that the impact of motivation on information processing happens at a very early stages of information processing at the brain level, which means that people don't really take time to, it actually means that there's a guidance of the visual system, right, based on somebody's motivation. So the like top-down influences, as we say. So people's motivations and existing beliefs sort of steer somebody's attention towards certain sources of information. And people seem to process that very, very quickly within, I'd say, 200 milliseconds, right? And that's what makes it very hard to change. So in the context of political psychology and politics, there's a bunch of studies that follow up on this rationale and look on motivated reasoning and the neural correlates of motivated reasoning within the political context. I'm not going to outline all of these studies, but I think it's worth sort of focusing on Kaplan's 2016 study, who used an MRI on the neural correlates of maintaining political beliefs in face of counter evidence. So he practically put people in the scanner. He presented 40 liberals with arguments that contradicted their strongly held political and non-political views. And he actually found like a bold signal in the orbitofrontal cortex, so in the front sides of the brain, during challenges that correlated positively with the degree of belief change, while the bold signal in dorsomedial prefrontal cortex correlated negatively. This is what you see like in this side of the plot. So on the left part of the screen, for those of you online, and on the bottom side, you can actually see a comparison between political issues plotted in darker color and non-political issues plotted in green color, suggesting that people are more willing to update their beliefs. So this is belief change here. So people it's more easy for people to update their prior beliefs if these beliefs are not political. Why? Because politics really gets under your skin. So I think that this study very, very nicely, oh, sorry, I didn't explain the other part. So it practically shows these bold responses. They also come like in the amygdala and the insula, two parts of the brain that have to do with processing of value. So whether it's monetary value or value about evidence and how good the evidence is. when they evaluate counter evidence. So when people are confronted with counter evidence to their own existing beliefs, these areas in the brain light up. Yeah. So actually, this is one of the first studies to show specific regions of interest at the brain, which relates to the idea that the update of beliefs is influenced by motivation, right? So people's prior existing beliefs have to do with which certain centers in the brain are being activated. So I kind of like wanted to follow up a little bit on this hypothesis because I find it very compelling. And I'd like to be more interested in the functional relationships and mechanisms that operate behind these effects that we see. So what is this motivated reasoning? And how does it work with belief updating? So does it actually influence, and in what way does it influence belief updating? So based on existing literature, there are some psychological constructs like cognitive rigidity, conservatism, need for cognition, need for closure, or analytical thinking, which sort of predicts the extent to which individuals are willing or not to update their beliefs or become more rigid or not. Yeah. So for instance, like people with very rigid prior ideas, we know that they are part of this group that demonstrates that effect on belief updating. So they're poorer in updating their beliefs. So how do we measure that? Not with statements, but with something more fundamental. So when it comes to cognitive science, one of the gaps that we aspire to merge between the social, and the micro, as I started explaining earlier, is to focus on fundamental properties of how our cognition works. Right. So instead of just using statements and things that come from the actual world, like stimuli, which are ecologically valid, as we say, we are mostly interested in cognitive science to understand the basic mechanisms of how human thought and the human mind operates. So how do we measure that? How do we measure belief updating in this sense, if it's not about beliefs at the level of attitudes? Because we need something more abstract than that. So belief updating relies on how we process information and we make sense of the world. It has to do with how we judge intuition versus evidence. And for instance, patients with schizophrenic delusions and people who believe in conspiracy theories, they tend to jump to conclusions faster than ordinary people do. That means, and it's actually proven by research in psychiatry and corresponding fields, that they require less information to actually make a decision, to come to a consensus and make a judgment than ordinary population does. And how they typically study this, in these fields, is with what we say the Beats task. So the jumping to conclusion bias is measured or operationalized by the Beats task. So what is this? It's a task where somebody takes consecutively samples from these 2 jars of marbles that I showed you. And at some point, the person needs to make a decision on whether the dominant color in those jars is darker or light gray in this instance. Yeah, so it's a sampling task whereby people sequentially look at one piece of evidence, and on the basis of that evidence, they update their prior belief about the distribution of colors in the jar. Make sense? Yeah, so far? Good. And of course, at the end, the person needs to make a decision, and they can choose to draw from 1 to 10 beats every time. It's up to them. So some people, they draw less evidence. Some people require more evidence. And at some point, they just need to make a decision. And, depending on whether the decision is correct or not, they receive feedback. So that's the basic design. So on the basis of this and the prior literature that I very briefly introduced, we developed a list of hypotheses. I'm not going to read all those through, but I'd rather like to explain them as we go along. And I just want to show you how the online version of this experiment looked like. So people got this information. So we framed this game in terms of an elections night, right? Where people have to sort of make decisions about the winner of the elections. Okay, so we had a framing like that to sort of engage people in the game and put them in the concept. And we actually designed like two parts of the study. So the one part is the behavioral, so like an online study, whereby we used 420 people online via MTurk. These were American people, and we actually had the chance to sample from a pool of conservatives and a pool of liberals. So I'll explain later if that was actually achieved and to what extent. So that was like the online part, and we also designed like an equivalent of this very game in the lab while we performed EEG measurements. So we measured people's responses while they were playing along this game. And I have to say we had like a sort of like 2 or 3 block design, which suggests at the beginning they just had a baseline measurement. And then we actually introduced this manipulation. So we told them that now we know that the dark gray sample actually represents a conservative right-wing party, right? So that, as you can imagine, especially at the UVA, a very left-wing leaning university, it comes like in juxtaposition with like people's prior beliefs. So we make them, we give them like a political context, telling them that one of the 2 colors is associated with something you don't like. So we try to manipulate their motivation on how they judge evidence thereafter. Okay, we did the same thing in the online study, obviously. And we calculated how many observations we need. This was a really clean project, I have to say. So we registered everything, the hypothesis, power analysis, everything on Open Science Framework. So I'm particularly happy for learning how to do this through the Hot Politics Lab. All right, and this is how the design of the study looks. I think you guys got it. So people just like sample sequentially these colored beads, and at some point they need to make a prediction, and they need to predict the winner at this point here, yeah. And afterwards, some feedback comes in. Now, the EEG equivalent version of that, we time logged the responses we were interested at measuring at the moment those screens were presented. So every time a new sample came in, every time a decision was made, and every time a feedback screen was presented to the participants. So we had like different measurements, like different time points to look on how the brain processes that information. Okay, and of course, what we were primarily interested was the difference between, what happens before the manipulation and what happens afterwards. Because if there is some motivation happening, right, if this is successful, what we did, we should see, and if the hypothesis is correct, we should see this difference playing out on these brain responses. Yeah. All right. I know I have little time left, but please bear with me. I knew this would take more than 25 minutes, but I chose not to say anything beforehand. Okay, so some like a little glimpse on different measures of ideology. That's what you see here. So we included different ways of measuring ideology because I guess you agree with me that there's so many ways of doing that. So we have socioeconomic conservatism, the scale by Everett, like that's like a CSU, like a statement-dependent measurement. We use like a social and economic identity, like as 2 dimensions, right? So economically liberal versus socially progressive, for example, as like another dimension. And we also use the classic single dimension ideology thermometer, yeah? So liberal conservative. And as it is evident, liberals do not actually represent a very homogeneous group, like so the liberals that we got from MTurk, as they don't always show this like uniform normal distribution. And for the analysis that follow, I'm going to show you things based on the grouping that came from MTurk. So there's still a bunch of analysis that we need to make to bring this project to a conclusion, a safe conclusion. But I'm going to present you that part of the data. All right. Online study results, and this is the behavioral part, yes. So we were interested on how many draws people make before they reach into a decision, right? The less, the more they jump to conclusion. So the more they demonstrate that bias, right? And we actually find evidence that conservatives tend to sample less, which sort of supports one of the 3 core hypotheses we had. So one of the things we're interested in is this asymmetry hypothesis. So there's a lot of work in political science claiming that there are asymmetries that like conservatives process things differently, like threats, like feelings of disgust, for instance, compared to liberals and vice versa. So the first hypothesis has to do with this asymmetry effect. And based on this behavioral data, we do find some asymmetry that conservatives actually tend to draw less samples at a time. We also look at reaction times, and it seems that conservatives tend to spend more time before they choose to draw another sample. So they need a little more time in processing this evidence, which is, as I'll explain later, a little bit seems at odd. What you see in the bottom right of your screen is practically like just a check to see how reaction times go about, like as we have different rounds of this game. I think this is like one of the interesting findings. So next to the group effect that I reported before, we look for how evidence in conservatism, how differences in conservatism or in extremity or in rigidity, so these were the three sort of core hypotheses, play out on this behavioral performance. So more rigid individuals, so this is what you see with H2B, seem to correspond to less draws before taking a decision. More conservative individuals, the same. Less cognitively flexible individuals, which is the opposite of rigidity, and obviously it correlates very highly, produces the opposite effect. So those who are more flexible, they seem to require more evidence before they actually jump to conclusions. And the second part of the behavior that we looked at had to do with making decisions. So we looked on whether the decisions were correct, how quickly people actually perform these decisions. And we still find some evidence in favor of this idea that conservatives need more time to decide. We also saw that they sample less before. And we also see that they show to be more confident for their decisions. So although they sample less, they take less evidence to make a decision, they report to be more confident about this, which I think it's a very interesting finding to follow up on. Okay, so very briefly, that's a lot of numbers. I just want to focus on some nice effects and stress the fact that still the effect sizes are very tiny in our study. Okay, and this is something that I have some ideas why this might be the case. And we are actually designing and launching these very days like a second online study to sort of try to reduce this variation and see what we can come up with. So there is like, it seems like to be some, let me place this. Does it work? No, it doesn't. So there seems to be like some evidence here in favor of the asymmetry hypothesis. There seems to be some evidence for the rigidity hypothesis. But when it comes to the ideological extremity, which suggests that people who lie more at the extremes of ideology, so extreme right, as you look at it, extreme left, yeah, those are the people who are more, it's more hard for them to change their prior beliefs and update their priors, which is a very legit hypothesis, right? I suppose. Anyway, there's like still some analysis to be done to be very confident about this. All right, and for the time left, I will briefly walk you through EEG findings. So as I explained, while people performed the task, we measured brain reactions. So whenever people saw a new colored sample and they make it a new drawing, we monitored what the brain did, what the brain waves looked like during that moment, okay? And here we find like some, on the left side, we see that like this is a grand average ERP, as we say. So it's across all participants and all observations we have. It looks like we have significant differences at the N200 range. So that means about 200 milliseconds after presenting the screen. And this difference seems to be significant if we compare the stimuli before the manipulation versus after the manipulation, which suggests that that manipulation actually does something on how people process visual information very, very early on, like already 200 milliseconds in the time stream. On the again, right side, what you see is that once we introduce the idea that the colored samples represent votes from the two ideologically distinct parties, again, we see like amplitude and latency differences between those two types of samples across like a range of components. So that's the N1, the P2, P3, and N4. By the way, for those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about here, this is just like positive or negative, depending on whether it goes up or down, positive, negative, yeah. And the P300 means a positive deflection at around 300 milliseconds. That's all about it. So we find that a bunch of components seem to be interesting for this process. There seems to be that people actually process that conservative sample with less attention. That's what this shows. So the blue line, which corresponds to those samples framed as the conservative party, the right-wing party, elicit less fluctuation in this signal, yeah, compared like to the other line. So this is some evidence that there is something happening at the very basic level of processing very abstract stimuli, which are simply connotated. They have just like simply linked to a political idea, right? And still, that manipulation seems strong enough to do something on how our brain operates in judging and weighting that basic information. So if you scale that up, I think, you know, it has like consequences for like misinformation and, you know, how people actually update prior beliefs, just like to put some context. We find like some additional differences in the EEG, which I think it doesn't make much more sense to go through in much detail. I think that the core message and the core story that I wanted to communicate was that. And again, here at the EEG, we already find some significant findings. And I have to say, we have run some other analysis, including oscillations and frequency, time frequency decomposition analysis in the EEG. And we also find some interesting findings over there. So I think that that's a very, very promising venue. Still, I feel a bit uncertain about the behavioral part, but I think, and I want to close with that, you know, before, you know, getting too excited here and saying that, hey, everything works and look at my significant values, before jumping to conclusions myself, right? I want to point out that like conceptual replications on what we do are very, very important because especially like when it comes like to novel ideas like this one, like novel paradigms that we haven't had like experience like in research with. So that's why we're now setting out like this follow-up study to see what happens in a different sample. Like we're going to throw that study in the Netherlands. And actually, the only difference here is that we're including a much wider sample, and we're also removing the feedback screen from the paradigm, simply because we think that it might actually confound that belief updating. So if people update their beliefs on the basis of feedback they get for how well they play the game, this confounds with what we are actually measuring. So we want to, you know, bulletproof ourselves from that criticism. And I guess I tried, and I think I made it to the 30 minutes. So I want to thank you for your attention, and the people online. Thanks for joining us. And of course, my Hot Politics Lab colleagues, at least at that time. There are way more people, and I don't have everybody's pictures. But thanks a lot. Right. I guess I can maybe sit. Curious what you guys like think of this line of work. I know it might be very different to what people are typically working with, but I would be very, very interested in your thoughts, questions, remarks.
So now we're taking questions from you guys and also from the people online. Can you show of hands?
Go ahead.
This would work, yeah.
Hi, Diamantis. Thanks for your talk. Steven here.
Hold on, because we have like an online speaker. Stephen?
Yes.
Let's hear your question. We also had an audience question live here, but like since people are easier to reach here, let's.
Your post-manipulation ERP effect was, let's say, much earlier than your, let's say, your neutral politic effect. So your post-manip was more like an early attention effect, right?
Indeed, we found some latency effects as well. Yes.
So is that? But
I'll repeat.
it's not entirely clear because one said conservative and the other was neutral, or I didn't entirely get the other condition of the post or the other group was what? Yeah, what was that?
Right. So they were. I think that the one you refer to, perhaps like I can search for that slide again. It's this one. Yes. So we have Steven Scholter. He's an associate professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of Amsterdam, and he's asking. Can we see this? With regards like to this slide. Let me see.
Yes, this one.
Yep, good. And you can see it, but like nobody in the room can actually see it. Let's see. There it is. Okay. So could you please repeat the question?
Yes. On the right-hand side, it says conservative versus neutral.
Indeed. So that is the difference in between like the two colored marbles. So one of them was associated with the Conservative Party, and we had counterbalanced like the colors across participants. So a few people saw that the dark beat was associated with the Conservative Party. The other half of the participants saw that the white was associated with the Conservative Party. So we tried to counterbalance for that. And what you see is the comparison between the ERP elicited in response to each of those two different ones. So the neutral one, the one that had not been associated with anything, versus the one that had been associated with conservatism.
Okay. And then, okay, so that's a very early effect and also just all over different effects, but mainly in terms of sensory processing.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
That's what I also think. Thanks for the question. I appreciate it. And for good to see you also. There was like a question in the audience, and that was, it's actually one of my students. I'm very happy for that. There's an, yeah, that's a very good question. So the question is, how do we measure extremity, right? Like when it comes like to ideology. So what we would normally do is that we would take like the first and fourth like quatriles like of the responses, like those who have like responded like very extremely on this like single dimensional space. However, and I have to say that we haven't done that thoroughly simply because we didn't have enough participants that actually lied so far away, like in the distribution. So one of the reasons why we haven't found, I think, an effect for this extremity, like some support at least, for this extremity hypothesis relates to the fact that it's very hard like to get these kind of people to fill in your surveys, right? Like people who lie at the extremes of the distribution. Thanks for the question.
Just a point of order. Can you moderate the discussion and then clearly repeat the question so that, because otherwise we're in three different, like we're here.
Yeah. No, I just
online.
I also couldn't hear.
And in Amsterdam. So
I just couldn't hear.
yeah, no, that's. But let's, because otherwise the session is where it's also to get your answers across. I think it's important.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering what you make finding that conservatives made less draws to conclusions, and they also are more confident in their decision, but then they also need more time, as you said. Because I would think that then they think harder about it, but yeah, I'm curious about
Yeah, I don't know actually. I'm not really sure myself about why this might be. So what we started with as a hypothesis about this was based like on existing literature on threat sensitivity, stress sensitivity. So you know, under like these kind of like conditions, they might actually require more time. So that part is, I guess, like it makes sense like to explain more. When it comes like to drawing less evidence, I think that the core idea is that very often, like in questionnaires and in surveys, we see that conservatives tend to correlate with things like cognitive closure. Yeah. Because we see these correlations in the literature, we thought that perhaps actually one way to sort of go around this task is to finish up as quickly as possible to to bring closure. So behind that motive of something less, perhaps there is nothing more than just like simply that like enhanced need for closure. Yeah. So perhaps it doesn't really mean something politically if that's what you're asking. We don't know, though.
Predictions changed after you made it about politics.
I'll be very honest with you, I don't remember. So we looked it up, and there was something, but I can't remember on top of my head. It should have been in there, though. So point taken. There was something happening though with performance. So if I'm not mistaken, performance was better in the first block compared to the second, but with a with a big question mark there because I really can't remember.
Full sample or maybe even.
So that I can answer actually. So are you referring to making the decision? Yeah, I see. So that is an interesting question. So for conservatives, it seems that once the political thing is being introduced, these reaction times for making a decision seem to fall as we move to the next rounds, which suggests like a sort of habituation effect. People just learn to play this game more efficiently, and they don't need so much time. That's what I would, make out of this. But if that's the case, what's then interesting is the fact that the liberals, they don't show that effect, that habituation effect. So if you see up here, yeah, so the gray line, which corresponds actually to the liberals, seems to be more stable over time, over different rounds of this game. Yeah. That particularly I haven't looked at. That might be a very interesting question actually to look at. So what happens exactly at that moment of that is a very good idea actually. Thank you. Yes.
It is something to do with the context in the sense that if we acknowledge that conservatism is more majoritarian in the society, then the issue for somebody who is conservative, this need of foreclosure or reaching a quicker decision, comes from the idea that I don't want. I'm focusing on who am I at the fact that I don't want to belong to something minoritarian in society, basically. And so I have my ideas and I reach a decision. Whereas because I cannot understand why this mechanism can be different between people according to their ideology, basically. I can't find it.
Get your mind around this idea.
Yeah.
So
I would say that we have literature on social influence. I'm saying this. So in a sense, the others are looking at the message, that they are minoritarian in society. It's a hypothesis. I don't have a clue, but I'm trying to see why people at the mechanism level could be different according to their ideology.
It's a very fair point, and actually that's a whole idea of this project, trying to explain that very question, right? So the way I see ideology, and it's obviously not just me, but like a few colleagues who work like on this idea, is that it's not just, you know, like a very there are no specific parts of the brain that are painted blue or red. So the brain is a very complex organ, and what it does is that it processes, it classifies, it encodes, transducts, and classifies information. I said that. So practically, it's a machinery that tries to make predictions on the basis of evidence that comes from everyday life. And every time some new piece of evidence, like a new visual thing, like, oh, I saw something, you know, falling down, right? Like happens to you, your brain registers that and tries to communicate that in a language that the brain understands. So this complexity, I think that ideology sort of emerges from very small and micro processes that happen together at similar times, giving rise to something that manifests to us in our eyes as ideology. Whereas in fact, it's nothing than simply seeing and discriminating between different pieces of information, adding meaning whenever meaning needs to be added, and then all these things scales up to something as we call ideology. So if that hypothesis is true, I'm not claiming it is, I'm really interested myself, then we should expect that different mechanisms are, you know, behind these phenomena. Risk perception, like, you know, being sensitive to threats, for instance, and risks. It's something that literature has shown continuously that works differently between liberals and conservatives. Now, if you ask me what makes what and whether, you know, being a conservative makes you be like that, or if it's like a predisposition of how the mind works that sort of fosters, like this kind of mindset fosters ideology in a different manner, that I don't know. It's a very big question to answer. But I would make this idea that one of these core mechanisms to look at should be belief updating, because I think that it has a lot of rational and documented studies behind.
So, Bert, Jacob,
Thanks, Diamantis. It's great to see this study develop. You have an experimental manipulation, but then a lot of the causal interpretation is given based on grouping individuals in certain subgroups. How can we not know whether or not they're unobserved confounders that actually explain the pattern? So it's not ideology, but something else. And the same for all the rigidity things, it's not something else. So are the effects that you present here, are you drawing the right conclusions? And what can you do to refute that critique?
Well, I mean, having like a manipulation, showing that a manipulation seems to be doing something implies that there is something going on, like with motivated reasoning that seems to be more causal. So that once like this like sort of cognition gets activated, it seems that the brain starts operating at a different state, very roughly said. So I think that that's one. Then about the rigidity and the other mechanisms, I really don't know. I do think that some of these actually are moderators, so they work in combination with ideology. So for instance, somebody who holds, let's say, left-wing beliefs, yeah, and at the same time has like a very rigid mindset, which could be a different kind of trait, right? But it happens to be there more strongly activated as opposed like to somebody else who for whom it doesn't work like that. Perhaps that first person is more likely to like show these kind of effects, to manifest these kind of effects. In terms of the grouping thing, yes, we're obviously not claiming like causal relationships here, right? So this is like purely correlational. We try to see which of these groupings seem to explain what the big picture is, and find and you know, give like provide some evidence in support or not, like for each of these hypotheses. Some first evidence.
dichotomizing these ideology variables and not, right? That's what you're seen to doing, right?
No, I'm not. I'm only doing that like with the conservatives and liberals, like based on the MTurk pool of participants that I was given. So that was like an a priori sort of group, which I have to say I'm also a little bit skeptical about. More analysis need to be done there, and I'm not doing that in general, but only for the extremity hypothesis. So those people who really like the extremes, because we need to classify those. For the rest, we are doing linear regression. So, you know, we have to say that the more the conservative, the more likely or the less likely. Thank you.
Jakob, and then you.
Wondering, since you see this effect for ideology, but no effect for how extreme people are with regards to the ideology. Because of the first effect, I would assume that it makes sense to look also at the interaction, because there are ideological differences. What does ideological extremity result in for liberals and conservatives? Have you thought about that, or what do you?
Absolutely, yes. And we just like couldn't do it because we didn't have enough observations. So you saw like the power, the effect sizes were so tiny. We were like we had just as much power as we could to simply detect. And as I said, this is a first study, so we do deserve like to replicate this, and then, you know, given the power, look at the interactions. Absolutely, yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Thinking in particular within the political domain, because it involves self-conceptualization and ego-evolving mechanism, can be a long-term process. It doesn't necessarily mean that once we come into contact with a specific stimulus, we're going to process it in a way that it begins to happen. So I was wondering, what are the limitations of an EEG study when it comes to comprehensively examining the.
I mean, it's always a fair question from the more social science side. I take it in. I'm also, you know, skeptical myself, being a social scientist. So what EEG can give you is some explanation of what happens at the millisecond level. So it can explain what happens when you see, like on two pretty much identical stuff, and I don't know, if you didn't have coffee in the morning, right? So at the moment that these two things present to you, if there's a difference on how your brain actually works, we can pick that up with EEG, very roughly speaking. So if we can actually detect these effects at such a fundamental abstract paradigm such as this one, then we can imagine what kind of implications this can have at the macro level. Now, if you have some ideas on how to actually show that and make that network of nomological evidence needed to actually make the jump to the macro level, I'm all in for sharing a cup of coffee with you. But indeed, this is a fair point, yes. So we're always limited in terms of like ecological validity, yeah, with the studies. And that is why we try to also see, you know, take this like outside the lab, see what happens, you know, out there. Perhaps we can use something like this in future with positive and negative news, and tell people, is this world that you're now in a positive news world or a negative news world based on what you have seen? And you can sort of scale that abstract experiment up to the level that it captures some of this ecological relevant variation, practically. Step by step, it's the answer. Thank you.
We have two questions online that I'll approach right now, and then we still have time. People might do. So a question by Sophia. I know this was not your focus of your research, but I'm curious if there was any data collected about religious affiliation, etc., and if that played any role in this, or if you know of any research similar to this taking religious convictions, etc., into your consideration.
Right. So there's that's a very interesting question. So there is like this very nice book by Michael Sammer, The Believing Brain. which actually discusses very much this whole world of religiosity, absurd beliefs, magical thinking, conspiratorial mindsets. So, and yes, in light of how the brain works, like for those individuals who score high on these constructs, for instance. And there are like definitely some links like with religiosity. We do actually have some data. So we did collect the religious background of you, yourself, your mother, your father, and how conservative the neighborhood you grew up in is. We haven't looked at it though, and it's definitely one of the to-do points in the list. Sophia, thank you for your question.
We have another question by Elise. How strong is the correlation between brain structure and political beliefs in young people?
So we don't know actually. We didn't look at that in this study. So brain structure is something that relates like to brain matter most likely, and we need like other kind of equipment to look at that. So sorry to disappoint you. I don't have an answer to this.
We still have some time.
Ideology. I was wondering if you were talking into the investigation and observed the differences. Was there anything to go like losing some points the more guesses you make?
So if I get that correctly, and to repeat the question, so if I think that risk aversion might be something that actually explains what we see here. Oh, as an additional factor. In principle, I do think that risk aversion is one of these like cognitive capacities or fundamental sort of properties of how the brain works. That is definitely interesting to look in this line of work. But that's an interesting point, you actually raise there. So, the less beats I get, the more risk I take. And the more, samples I have, the more evidence I have, the less risk. So I feel more certain about our decision. That's also the idea why we had this like certainty slider at the end to measure whether decisions were experienced as such. So yeah, it's a really good point. I need to think a little bit about that. In first glimpse of an eyes, I'd say that it might actually be even a confounding factor in that sense. So how like risk aversion plays out, and are we measuring risk aversion perhaps here? So with liberals, if liberals like require more samples, that means that they're ready to take more risk, which is sort of juxtaposing to quite some of the literature out there. It's a fair point. I need to think a little bit about that. Thanks. Yeah. So there were some of the measurements we did like before the task and some of the measurements afterwards. When it came like to some things about ideology in particular, we on purpose we measured it beforehand because we did want to sort of activate this political context. And then the elections eve game comes in, it kind of makes sense. But we did ask like about rigidity and the other stuff, like we asked it at the end so that it wouldn't confound with what we measure in the task. So there has no randomization taking place in how the questions were presented in that sense.
Think of ways to manipulate conservatism.
Is this like off camera?
No, because I'm thinking that in line with opinions that conservatism apparently traits. also it's more carried in faith. So some of the aspects of the game might drive you towards being more conservative, for example, because your favorite party is losing.
Good point. So first, let me say that when it comes like to this task, I think that if anything, there should be something more fundamental going on, like more of a trait thing. Like I think that rigidity, for instance, is a trait. To what extent it binds with ideology or not, that's a different discussion.